It was early morning in Rome. The streets were already full of people who were talking, walking, taking pictures, or simply looking around. The sun was shining, the air was warm, and there were birds singing over the old buildings. But there was something different about this day. It was not a normal day in Rome. It was the day of the Pope's funeral. Many people had come from all over the world. Some were carrying small flags. Some had rosaries in their hands. Others just looked curious. There were journalists too. They were standing near big cameras, talking to microphones, and trying to catch interesting moments. I was there too. I had decided to travel to Rome 2 days ago because I thought this would be a very historic moment. I didn't know much about popes or Catholic ceremonies. But I wanted to see how people came together when someone so important died. If you have ever been to Rome, you know how magical it can feel. Every street has a story. Every stone seems old and wise. That morning, even though there were thousands of people, it was strangely quiet. People were whispering instead of speaking normally. Maybe it was out of respect. Maybe they were just waiting. Suddenly, I heard a group of nuns talking behind me. One of them said she had been to 3 papal funerals in her life. Another nun told her that this one felt the saddest. I wanted to ask why, but I was too shy. A man next to me was explaining something to his little daughter. He said the Pope had lived a long life, had done many things for the church, and had finally gone to heaven. The little girl asked if she could see heaven from here. The father laughed softly and said maybe if they were patient. As the time for the funeral approached, more and more people arrived. Police officers started closing some streets so the procession could move safely. I noticed how organized everything was. Even though there were so many people, there was no pushing or shouting. I found a spot near a big fountain. I could see the giant screen they had put up for people who couldn't get close to St. Peter's Square. On the screen, I saw the cardinals, bishops, and priests getting ready. Their clothes were so beautiful and detailed that they looked almost royal. The funeral began with prayers. A choir started singing. It was so powerful that for a moment, I forgot I was standing on a hard stone street with the sun burning my neck. I closed my eyes and listened. When I opened my eyes, I saw some people crying. Others were holding hands. Some were taking photos with their phones. I thought it was interesting how different people reacted to the same thing. Maybe for some it was a very spiritual moment. Maybe for others it was more like being part of history. A man behind me began telling his friend that he had traveled from Argentina. He said he felt he had to come because the Pope had been an inspiration for him. The friend nodded and said he understood. They spoke quietly, but I could hear the emotion in their voices. Then came the part where they carried the coffin. It was a simple wooden coffin, not golden or decorated with jewels like some people might imagine. That surprised me. I thought it would be more luxurious. But later someone told me that popes often chose simplicity for their funerals to show humility. That made me respect it even more. As they carried the coffin out, many people crossed themselves. Others waved small handkerchiefs. It was a sea of small movements. You could feel the sadness, but also a kind of peace. I guess when a person has lived such a long and meaningful life, death feels less frightening. I tried to take a picture, but my hands were shaking. Not because I was sad, but because I felt like I was watching something the whole world would remember. After the Mass ended, people slowly started to leave. Some stayed to pray. Others looked at souvenirs on small stands. I decided to walk around a bit. I needed to process everything I had just seen. As I walked, I heard different languages. English, Spanish, German, Polish, even some languages I couldn't identify. Everyone was there for the same reason, even if they had come from very different places. That was actually beautiful. I stopped by a small cafe. I ordered a cappuccino and sat down. The waiter asked me if I was in town for the funeral. When I said yes, he smiled sadly and said it had been a very emotional week for everyone. He added that the city would feel strange without the Pope. I nodded. Even though I didn't live there, I could somehow understand what he meant. While sipping my coffee, I remembered something my grandmother once told me. She said that funerals were not only about saying goodbye, but also about remembering how the person had lived. I thought maybe that was why people seemed both sad and calm. When I finished my drink, I decided to take one last walk by the Tiber River. The sun was starting to go down, painting the sky orange and pink. It was hard to believe that earlier that day, I had stood with thousands of strangers, sharing a moment that was bigger than any of us. I took a deep breath. Rome smelled of old stones and flowers. It was a smell that made you think of time, of all the people who had come and gone before. I realized that maybe this was the best way to honor someone who had spent his life serving others. By simply being there, witnessing, and carrying the memory forward. As I walked along the river, I saw small groups of people sitting on the low stone walls. Some were eating sandwiches, some were smoking, and others just stared at the water. I decided to sit for a while too. My feet were tired and my mind was still full of images from the funeral. Next to me, two young women were speaking in French. I didn't understand most of what they were saying, but I caught a few words like beautiful and peaceful. They laughed gently. I liked that even on such a serious day, people could still find moments to smile. A few meters away, an old couple was sitting very close together. The man was telling the woman that he had once seen another pope many years ago when he was a boy. He said back then there were fewer cameras, fewer tourists, and somehow it all felt more local. The woman squeezed his hand and told him that maybe times had changed, but faith was still the same. That made me think. Even if the world was moving fast, people still needed something bigger than themselves to hold on to. Maybe that was why so many had come to Rome, to feel connected to each other, to history, or to God. I took out my phone and started writing some notes. I didn't want to forget the little details. Like how the guards had stood so straight, how the choir had sounded like voices from another world, or how a small boy had tried to throw a flower toward the coffin but it fell at his feet. These were the tiny moments that made the day feel real. After a while, I stood up and continued walking. I passed souvenir shops selling rosaries, small statues of saints, and postcards of the Vatican. I heard a vendor telling a woman that this pope had been loved by many because he was humble and close to ordinary people. The woman nodded and said she had always thought he looked kind. I kept going until I reached a small bridge. From there, I could see St. Peter's Basilica in the distance. Its big dome was glowing in the last light of the day. I wasn't Catholic, but it still felt special. Maybe because I knew millions of people found hope and meaning in that place. On the bridge, a street musician was playing a violin. The music was soft and slow. A little girl dropped a coin into his case and smiled. The musician nodded and kept playing. It was a simple moment, but it made me strangely emotional. By then, the streets were less crowded. Most people had gone back to their hotels or homes. Rome felt calm again, almost like it had taken a deep breath after a long day. I decided to find some dinner. I picked a small place that was half empty. The waiter seemed tired but friendly. He recommended a plate of pasta with mushrooms, so I trusted him. As I waited for my food, I looked around. There was a family at another table, probably tourists. The father was showing his kids pictures on his phone, maybe from the funeral. The kids looked a bit bored. I smiled because children usually didn't understand the weight of these things. For them, Rome was probably just a fun city with pizza and gelato. When my food arrived, it was delicious. I ate slowly, enjoying each bite. The waiter came back and asked if I liked it. I told him it was perfect. He smiled and said today had been hard for everyone, so he was glad to hear something nice. After dinner, I took another short walk. Rome was so beautiful at night. Lights reflected on the cobblestones. Small groups of people were still talking on corners. A dog barked somewhere. It was life continuing even after a day full of death and farewells. I returned to my hotel room and lay down. My feet hurt, but my heart felt full. I thought about everything I had seen. The thousands of faces, the tears, the prayers, the songs, the sun shining on the old stones. Then I remembered something. Earlier that day, when the coffin was being carried, I had noticed a young man close his eyes and whisper something. Maybe it was a prayer. Maybe it was just his way of saying goodbye. I would never know. But it stayed with me. I realized that each person there had brought their own hopes, sorrows, memories. The funeral was not just about one man. It was about all of us and how we face life and death. How we try to find meaning even when things feel heavy. As I fell asleep, I promised myself that I would remember this day. Not just as a historical event, but as a lesson. That sometimes you have to stop, watch, and listen. And that by doing so, you can understand a little more about what it means to be human. The next morning, I woke up early. I packed my things and got ready to leave. When I stepped outside, the streets already looked normal again. People were going to work, buses were running, tourists were taking pictures. If you didn't know, you would never guess that just yesterday, this city had said goodbye to a pope. At the airport, I stood in line behind an elderly woman who had a small Vatican flag sticking out of her bag. She noticed me looking and gave me a warm smile. I smiled back. Without saying a word, we both knew we had been part of the same day, the same farewell. That was enough. When my plane took off, I looked out the window at Rome getting smaller and smaller. I thought of all the stories happening there right now, all the prayers still being whispered, all the candles still burning in dark churches. Even far away in the sky, I felt strangely close to the city. Maybe because when you share something powerful with thousands of people, it becomes a small part of who you are too. When I landed in my home country, everything felt both familiar and strangely different. The airport was busy, people were hurrying around with suitcases, announcements kept repeating, and kids were complaining they were hungry. It was the usual noisy scene. But inside me something had shifted. It was hard to explain to anyone who hadn't been there. How could you tell them about standing shoulder to shoulder with strangers from every corner of the world, just to honor a man most had never met in person? How could you explain the quiet moments, the shared tears, the sense that something much bigger than all of us was happening? That evening I went to see my parents. Over dinner, they asked me about the trip. I told them about the streets full of people, the beautiful music, the simple wooden coffin, and the way the sun had shone on St. Peter's Basilica. My mother listened with wide eyes. My father said it sounded like a once-in-a-lifetime thing. I nodded. Because it truly was. The next day, I went back to work. My coworkers were talking about usual stuff. Someone was complaining about traffic. Another person was excited about a new phone. It was all normal, but my mind kept drifting to Rome. I caught myself staring at my computer screen, remembering the way people had prayed together, or how a choir had sung so beautifully that it felt almost like heaven was close. At lunch, I tried to describe it to a friend. I told her that even though I wasn't Catholic, I felt moved by the unity, by seeing thousands of people with different languages and lives come together. She smiled and said maybe that's what true humanity looked like. I liked that thought. In the weeks that followed, small things would suddenly remind me of that day. A church bell ringing downtown. A woman crossing herself before getting on a bus. Even the smell of incense from a tiny shop made me pause and remember. One evening, I was walking home when I saw a group of tourists looking lost. I stopped and helped them with directions. They thanked me a lot. As I walked away, I realized that maybe the funeral hadn't just been about saying goodbye to a pope. Maybe it was also about learning to be kinder, to pay more attention to the people around us. A few days later, I found a small wooden cross in my backpack. I had bought it from a street vendor near the Vatican without thinking much. Now it felt special. I put it on my desk. Not because I had suddenly become very religious, but because it reminded me of that day in Rome. Of how fragile and precious life was. One morning, I got a message from someone I had met on the trip. It was a young woman from Poland. We had talked only briefly by the river, sharing a sandwich because both of us were too tired to keep standing. She wrote that she was still thinking about the funeral and hoped I was well. We exchanged a few more messages. It was nice to feel that connection hadn't ended when we left Rome. Sometimes late at night I would replay the scene in my mind. The thousands of people standing in silence. The moment the coffin appeared. The slow walk of the pallbearers. The powerful singing. And how, when it was all over, the crowd broke into small quiet conversations like soft ripples on water. It made me think about how we all carry stories. Each person I had seen there had a reason for coming. Maybe they had lost someone and wanted comfort. Maybe they were searching for hope. Maybe they simply wanted to witness history. All of those reasons were valid. That was the beauty of it. A sweet discovery about learning. You know what's really cool about all this? Without even realizing it, by following this simple story, your brain has just absorbed tons of useful English. You picked up how to use small connecting words naturally. You saw different ways to describe feelings and places. You heard how native speakers might tell a memory or share an observation. And the best part is you didn't even have to memorize boring grammar charts or repeat long lists of vocabulary. That's the power of stories. They teach you almost like magic. Your brain just enjoys the journey, and the language becomes part of you. So if you keep listening to stories like this every day, imagine how easily English will start to flow for you. You'll surprise yourself by suddenly knowing how to say things you never studied directly. I'd love to keep helping you grow your English in the most fun way possible. So if you liked this story, do me a small favor, give this video a thumbs up, hit that subscribe button, and ring the little bell so you never miss our daily stories. Also, drop a comment below. Tell me, have you ever been to a ceremony that felt this powerful? Or is there a place in the world you'd love to visit one day? I read every single comment, and I can't wait to hear your thoughts. Keep learning, keep smiling, and I'll see you in the next story.